We all know about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the supply of essential items such as personal protective equipment. But what about Canada's supply of prescription medicines? The following is episode 1 of a 2-part podcast series produced by the Canadian Generic Pharmaceutical Association that explores the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on Canada's supply of prescription medicines and what steps need to be taken to ensure our prescription drugs are available when we need them. In episode 1, host Hugo de Grandpre and CGPA's president Jim Keon discuss the timeline of events that challenged Canada's medication supply, how generic drug companies reacted to keep medicines on pharmacy shelves and in our hospitals, and the lessons learned that led to the creation of CGPA's blueprint for a sustainable supply of prescription medicines for Canadians.
Good morning and welcome. And Jim, thank you for joining us today to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on your industry and on Canada's supply of prescription medicines.
Hey, Hugo. Very glad to be here and chatting with you.
Jim, I'd like to take you back to March or April of 2020. The pandemic was just declared in Canada, putting immense pressure on supply of medicines for Canadians. We know that generic drugs are dispensed to fill more than 70% of all prescriptions in Canada. So this was a very important challenge for your industry. How did it play out for the generic pharmaceutical industry, and how was the industry forced to pivot and respond to ensure that our drug supply remained intact in Canada?
If I go back to March, we had been hearing for a number of weeks that there was problems with this new coronavirus in China. But really in March, when I think the shock hit, and initially we weren't sure how this was going to affect our industry, I think I can say that overall these were unprecedented challenges. Luckily, we have a cohesive group of companies within our association. We have 5 large manufacturers in Canada. They are producing a range of medicines, and that has allowed them to switch and pivot very quickly. And within Canada, we had enough stock for several months. Overall, we did not see any catastrophic drug shortages as a result of COVID. We did, however, see governments imposing some export restrictions in terms of products that come from China, from India, where a lot of the starting materials come from, the active pharmaceutical ingredients. I think we were concerned about the ability of those products to continue to flow. Then we started to see reductions in flights, either canceled or dramatically reduced. A lot of products come by air. We saw shipping delayed, seaports backed up or not working at all. So all of these, I think, required a tremendous amount of attention and focus on the supply chain.
So following its own experience, CGPA published its blueprint for a sustainable supply of prescription medicines for Canadians. Could you give us an overview of the measures that you're proposing in there?
The blueprint identifies measures that we think are necessary to enhance our existing manufacturing capacity, make the international supply chain more resilient, and as well, we think Canada should move forward to, at a federal level, on a national level, build up some stockpiles of really key and necessary medicines that are needed to treat the COVID-19 pandemic or other health emergencies.
The blueprint has 3 areas of focus. And the first one is to strengthen the domestic pharmaceutical industry in Canada. I'd like to focus on this for this episode. What do you mean by that?
It includes more investments into our pharmaceutical infrastructure, wanting more plants. We'd like more R&D capacity, more warehousing, a wider range of products made in Canada. We do have the ability now to make pills, capsules, ointments, creams, injectable products, but we'd like to build up our capacity in all those areas. We've seen the provincial governments in Ontario and Quebec saying that they would like to, onshore more products, increase our resilience, increase the amount of products that are made in Canada. And I think one of the realities is that we need to look at the pricing structure. Is it sufficient to support that?
Is it? Is the cost structure built or appropriate to support more domestic production?
Everyone would like to have the lowest possible costs. And I think, frankly, that's been a government objective in Canada for the past decade or more. And achieving the lowest possible prices has weakened our industry to some extent. There have been some plant closures and job losses, increased reliance on imports, making our supply chain a little more vulnerable. With the pandemic, we've faced uncertainties in transportation and the movement of products. When our companies have been able to secure transportation, they've faced significant increased costs.
But at the same time, people are under the impression that prices of generics are higher in Canada. So what's the story there?
Well, the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board, which is a government agency, independent government agency, does monitor both brand name and generic prices. In its most recent report measuring prices up to 2018, it found that generic drug prices in Canada had decreased by almost 60%. What the PMPRB found is that Canadian prices of the comparator countries that it looks at, which are the large pharmaceutical manufacturing countries around the world, the Canadian prices are now below the average price as of 2018. So Canadians are getting good prices. They're getting quality products at very affordable and competitive international prices.
Well, in that case, has the generic industry generally had access to government support like you can see in other industries like aerospace or agriculture, for instance?
The answer is generally not. Generally, we have not had access to any special measures. I think the reality is that Canada's generic pharmaceutical industry has been to some extent taken for granted. There have been measures in place, on pricing. There have been measures in place on use of the low-cost alternative product, which typically is a generic, which has helped create demand for our products. But overall, we feel that the generic pharmaceutical industry in Canada should be considered a strategic asset by the government. And we think it should be part of the government's discretionary incentive program that offer benefits to priority industries. You mentioned a couple: aerospace, agriculture, and certainly, the secure access to good quality food at reasonable prices has to be a national priority. So does good access to good quality medicines at reasonable prices need to be a priority. And that's exactly what the generic drug industry does. So we think as we try to strengthen our industry, try to build our capacity with investments in more plant, more equipment, tax incentives, subsidies, grants, loans, and other types of credits need to be considered for the generic pharmaceutical industry.
Jim, the last two areas that you focused on in this first section of the blueprint relate to increasing generic and biosimilars utilization. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
We think that generic drug utilization should be increased. We're at close to 75% in Canada, but in the United States, they have close to 90%. So there's room to use a generic product. If generics were used more in place of much higher cost brand name drugs, the savings could reach up to $10 billion or more. Tremendous amount of savings.
Okay. And what about biosimilars?
The last area that we've focused on in terms of improving the domestic industry would be to build a sustainable market for biosimilars. And biosimilars in Canada are follow-on products for biologic medicines. Biologic medicines are complex medicines, often from living material, which are used very extensively now in cancer patients, rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's and colitis patients. They are extremely effective. They are more targeted than traditional chemical-based medicines. They're also extremely expensive. We now have in Canada more than 20 biosimilar or follow-on biologics. These are biologic products that made by another company after patents and other intellectual property measures expire. They're not being used in Canada enough. We have recommended that governments move forward with switching policies. Both governments and private drug plans actually would benefit tremendously from increasing the use of biosimilars. This would allow us to strengthen our industry in Canada, to bring more products in and to fulfill that need for Canadians more broadly.
Jim, to conclude and going back to the industry's reaction to the pandemic, would you say, or is it safe to say, that the industry was able to weather the storm?
We were able to avoid the worst possible scenario, and we were able to continue to make drugs available for Canadians. But I think going forward, there are measures that we should take to make sure that we're in a less fragile situation in the future.
Thanks, Jim. And we'll be discussing this in more details in our next episode, along with ways to improve the global supply chain and the need to stockpile necessary medicines. I look forward to it, and thank you for listening.